Oh, mate. Would have made great.
Great B-roll.
Yeah.
Probably would as well, actually. Okay. Quick, manufacture some B-roll now. We weren't recording when we were putting this together. Now we've got to say something humorous.
Now we need to humorous. No, I have nothing. I've used it all.
Laugh.
Oh.
Okay, welcome to the track by track for Minastron Blues. Today we're going to be talking about the last track, track 9, which is called Renonciation. And as usual, Henry's going to correct me on the pronunciation, maybe?
Renonciation. That was on purpose.
I'll take it. How'd you write this one, Henry?
Reno.
How did you write the song?
So what's curious about this song is that although it is a last on the album, the piano bit was the second written because it was an altogether different track originally. The second track on the album is called Deuil, and the backing was for that. However, Matt worked on it at the start and made it amazing. Made it too good. It's too epic. It's too spacey and like soaring, and it's just so good. It's like a feel-good song. It's great. However,
this is how he wraps up all of his criticism.
Yeah. I'm a positive guy. But the first half of the album was supposed to be dark and sad and threatening and menacing and lowly. So he failed. It just didn't fit, especially as a second song after Pénombre. It just didn't flow, and even though the track was great. So instead of sort of working on it, we sort of decided we'll just put it aside for the end and we'll work on something else for track number 2. That's how it became track 9, Renonciation. So I then had to write a whole new poem, which I eventually did in due course. I'll talk about that in a bit.
Yeah. And then from a production point of view, it's had an interesting backstory because I was originally writing for one poem and then we kind of did the switcheroo. But then in terms of the piano, Henry was saying just now actually that he didn't even realise that the piano at the start was piano. He like went back to the original take and was like, oh yeah, I can kind of maybe hear the original take in there.
I could not remember my piano part at all. I just didn't remember it, couldn't hear it. So I would listen back to the original just piano take and I was like, that's really nice.
So I did some complicated kind of hip hop chops, I guess. Not that I'm much of a hip hop guy. So I got the original piano, processed it with quite a few things: distortion, tape effects, reverb, some kind of complicated pitch shifting, like on top of the tape pitch shifting. So that's kind of interesting. And then chopped it into bits, put them on a sampler, and made a completely new riff out of the riff that Henry had. And that's why you didn't recognize it. And fun fact is, if you do all of your effects before you chop it up, you get this quite interesting thing where like the kind of reverb environment and the general like sound environment is slightly different for each sample, because if you cut a sample short, you're also cutting off the reverb tail. And if you leave a sample to run, then you've got the reverb tail in there. So it gives it a slightly shimmery, otherworldly effect where it's like it doesn't always feel like it's happening in the same space. So that's one to listen out for.
You did all the knob twiddling on my vocals.
I did all the knob twiddling on your vocals. I think your vocals aren't too knob twiddly this time.
Which then I had to change.
Yeah. The synthesizer knob twiddling on my vocals.
That's what I said.
So there's kind of three elements to this track. Ended up having like really not very many elements, which is one of those things which happened rather than being a decision. But anyway, so there's the chopped up piano. There's the synths, which I set an arpeggiator running and listened to Henry's vocal really carefully and turned all these knobs to kind of try and match what was going on in Henry's voice with a lot of care, and I tried to like match all the twists and turns. This is on my favorite synthesizer, which is an SH201 from Roland. Let's go. But unfortunately, I was doing all of that work for the thing which eventually became Day.
No, we're not using that.
No, we're not using that.
Poem. Here's a new whole track of vocals and stuff that won't work with what you've done. But it did.
That's exactly what we did. But I think it had a kind of nice back and forth. We were saying just before we recorded actually that it's been a theme of this project where you kind of like make something with reference to something, and then you take the reference away, and you're left with this like slightly odd residue. That feels like a theme of the whole thing. So it was kind of fun. A residue. There you go. Sneak peek of a different track. But so there was this process where I played along to your vocals, and then you delivered the new vocal along to my track that had a kind of residue of the process that made it, which I thought was kind of interesting. And then the last kind of nice bit of serendipity that happened because this backing was transported to be at the end of the album rather than at the start is that there's this really long outro that's just kind of like floaty arpeggiator, which when I was recording I was like, oh, that's so nice, and I was trying to balance between moments when you're talking and moments when you're not talking, so that there's a kind of a nice rhythm to the album as a whole. And I was like, oh, this section is so nice, but like, does it go on too long? But now there's this beautiful outro which lasts for ages. I think it's nearly a minute, which is the outro to the whole album, so it works beautifully.
Right.
And it was obviously your like incredible skill and judgment as like a lyricist.
Absolutely.
You know, you just saw that and you were like, that's got to be the end of the album.
Absolutely. I knew. I knew.
No serendipity at all.
Before you sent it to me, I knew. So it's called Renonciation, which is the act of renouncing something. I don't know if renunciation is a word.
I think so.
Maybe, you know. I forgot what I translated it to. Well, and interestingly enough, lyrically, although some of the first tracks I would, talk, sing to my piano playing, it quickly became just very 1-2 takes. Some of them are different takes because I didn't know where I'd started and where I'd stopped, so it was all just like loose. Yeah. But obviously for that, because the track had been there from the start,
you were
for
delivering
ages,
along to something.
Yeah, and I only did it at the end. It felt more like, oh, I've got a banger here. I can sort of like, I can time it. I can nearly have sung along to it if I wanted to. Hence me coming in with C'est le moment, and that felt great, and it was really different.
That's interesting. You do deliver it a lot more than the other ones, and I thought that was to do with the content, but it's as well to do with the process
it's
of it
both,
as well.
Yeah, it's definitely the content as well. You finally got to the end of the album and the end of the sort of process, lyrically speaking, the course of going through something and coming to terms, and going through the course of your emotions, and you get to the end and you're like, okay. And that's why it starts with C'est le moment, which means it's time. I didn't want to make it too positive though, because there's still a lot to do and a lot to go. It's like the process has been finished, but that whole process, of feeling low, about feeling all these emotions, it will probably happen again and again and again in your life. But at least every time it happens, every time you hit the floor, every time you fail, you're just a little bit more ready to carry on. So it's like all the optimism that's building up from the second half of the album has just been a bit curtailed, but in a slap of the wrist way to yourself.
Careful, don't get too excited.
Exactly. Yeah. But the music elevates it anyways because it sounds banging.
Yeah, Renonciation is French for banger. Cool. Should we fade in the track now?
Cut.
Yeah, we're fading in the track right now. It's happening right now. Actually.
C'est le moment. Plus rien à faire. Tout est fait. Et tout est à refaire. Dans le vacarme, dur de s'entendre. Et quand tombe le tourbillon, encore dur de s'écouter. Faire comme je dis, et non pas comme je fais. Mais à force, je ferme ma gueule vaut mieux rien dire. Le temps joue son tour, son passage une magie, un arrière-plan permanent, un secours fonctionnel, micro-changement cessant, sans doute la déception, 100 fois en tournant rond, 100 fois et insensé, c'est sans pitié et justifié. Mais l'acheminement continue, un brin de recul de plus, on coche, on s'approche, on se dénonce et on renonce. Plus près de s'engouffrer. Un jour dans la pénombre, à la bonne heure, libre, à terme, au sein du cyclone.